6 months living in the Grand Hotel. People got to know in the hotel that I was a biology teacher working at school. I remember I sat in the dining room and one of the waiters came and said, Bwana, there's someone at the front to see you. He has something. So I went out to the front desk of the hotel and there was this Ugandan man and he got an orange crate, a sort of wooden box with slats in it. I've got this for you. You're a biologist. What is it? So he gave me the box and I took the lid off and inside it was a dead snake. And it was a black mamba, venomous snake, but it was dead. Someone had obviously hit it. 2 meters long, this one. It was coiled up and heavy in this box. And I was there at the entrance of the Grand Hotel holding this box. And I thought, well, I can't stand here with it. He'd gone now. He'd done his job. He'd given me the snake. Now it was my job. So I thought, well, I'll take it to school tomorrow. So I was walking back to my room. And as I walked, the snake slid out of the box onto the floor. It came through the slats. It was dead, but it slithered onto the floor. Well, you could not have emptied the Grand Hotel faster if you'd shouted fire. I mean, it was a busy hotel. The snake slid onto the floor. There were shouts, screams, and the whole place emptied. I have never seen a building empty so fast in my life. And I couldn't understand it. The snake was dead, for goodness sake. It made me appreciate how the population regards snakes, because I just picked it up and put it back in the box. But no one appreciated it because the place was empty. There was no one there. Oh, darling, that was so funny.
The year was 1969. Graham Hobster gets his first teaching post at Kololo Secondary School in Kampala, Uganda. Hello and welcome to Expulsion at 50. My name is Dola Vasani. Back in March 2022, I spoke to Graham from his home in New Brunswick, Canada. Here he shares his experiences of being in Uganda and of the expulsion back in 1972. So let's hear about you and Uganda and how did that come into your life?
After I graduated in 1968 with honours degrees in zoology and botany, I got married in July 68. I was 21, my wife was 22. She was a teacher too. I decided to be a teacher, but I had to do a postgraduate before I could actually get in front of children. So we went to Leicester University and I did my postgraduate in education there. And while I was there, I was looking around for appointments for my first teaching post. I think the newspaper was called the Times Educational Supplement. I think that was where we looked in those days. And I remember seeing this advert, Kenya are looking for teachers. So I thought, oh, that sounds exciting. I mean, we are married, we are young, we have no family, we have no mortgage. if we are going to do exciting things, now's the time to do it. So I applied for Kenya to be a teacher there. I'd heard of Kenya and I knew a little bit about it, but not very much. But I quickly got a reply back saying, sorry, all the teaching posts available for Kenya are now full. Would you consider Uganda? Uganda? Where is that? What is that? So I had to go and start to do research to find out about Uganda. No internet, of course. You have to go, you have to find your books, you have to go to the library, you have to read up about who is the president, what's the history of the country, is it safe to go there? So it looked interesting. So my wife and I decided, yes, let's apply there. So the application went through. I had to go for interview in London. Uganda House, just off Trafalgar Square, and quite a formal interview. And then about 2 weeks later, I got a notice saying I'd been accepted and I would be hearing from the Ministry of Education in Uganda. This was a scheme that was subsidized by the British government, an aid scheme, so that the teachers would be paid the local teaching rate in Uganda, but the British government would top up the money to bring it up to a teacher's salary that it would be in UK.
So Graham, you say your wife was a teacher. Did she also apply?
No, she wasn't applying. She came along as an accompanying spouse. So that means they did not pay her at all, but they would pay her fare to get there and to bring her back. Because she was a qualified and experienced teacher, she'd done 1 year of teaching, very experienced. She was told that she would be allowed to apply local, and she taught at Nakasero Primary School in Kampala.
Do you think that there were many women who did apply at the time?
Well, we had to go on a training course before we went, and we met up with quite a few other teachers who were going out to Africa, not all to Uganda, some of them to Uganda. And most of them were couples. But it was usually, at that age, it was usually the husband who was applying for the post and the wife was accompanying. So times change. I mean, if it was nowadays, it would be very different. But that's how it was in 1969. You never thought about it then. It was just normal for the times. But when you look back on it, you think, wow, that was that was strange doing it that way.
So you hadn't done any teaching before then, like as a job?
2 months, I think, that I was posted to a school to practice in Leicester, just outside Leicester.
Were you intimidated, thinking, "Oh my God, I've only got 2 months of experience, and now I've got going off to East Africa to teach"?
Yeah, but at that age, you're not afraid of things. It's life is your oyster. You're ready to go, do anything. You don't worry about things like that when you're 21, 22, you know, Dollar. Yeah, we flew from Gatwick, British Caledonian Airways. I remember it was a VC-10. It's funny how you remember little details about it. It's quite a long flight, but it was a non-stop flight to Entebbe. Arriving at Entebbe, they opened the door and it was like walking into an oven, or more like an oven combined with a sauna. Oh, and the smells. How to describe it? It was something I'd never experienced before. The heat, the humidity, and the beautiful tropical smells. I can't say it was fruit or anything like that, but there was a different smell to the air. It overpowers the senses. You're right. Yeah, you feel it. It hits you from all sides. It's amazing. We were met at the airport by a representative of the British High Commission, and drove us that Entebbe road. I'll never forget that road from Entebbe to Kampala. That was an experience too. There was traffic on it, lot of bicycles, people walking, but there was not the heavy traffic, the heavy lorries, the continuous noise of horns and traffic. Because when I went back in 1999, it was a different world. It was a different world. But in 69, it was paradise, really was. And we were taken to the Grand Hotel, which is right in the center of Kampala, because there was no accommodation for us. But the problem was we stayed in the Grand Hotel in one room. I think it was room 111, Mia Moja Kumina Moja. I remember that.
How was your introduction to Kololo School?
Amazing, never forget it. The first day of school, the school started at 8 a.m. in the morning because the school was a double session school. It had the seniors, 8 o'clock till 1 o'clock, occupied the buildings with their staff. And in the afternoon from 1:30 till about 6, the juniors occupied the same building. And so in the morning at 8 o'clock, I was wondering what was going to happen. In front of the staff room, before us, below the steps, the entire school, the senior school, was assembled. And it was a big school. There were 2,000 pupils in the school of Kololo. It was a big school. And it was a sea of black and white because the school uniform was white. Can you believe going to school in pure white? White trousers, white shirt, and all this red soil and everything. And you think, how do they keep clean? Hundreds of these faces all looking up at the staff. And the headmaster spoke, and they had a microphone. He couldn't make himself sound, so they spoke with a microphone, and he introduced the staff for the new year. The position was each member of staff would take the microphone, was given a class list, their pupils for the year, and they had to read out the names. And then the staff would walk down the steps and the children would follow to their classroom. Well, this was my introduction. I was given the microphone, I was given a list. I wish I'd been given the list before to study it. And I had to try and pronounce these names. Well, the children found it so amusing. I'm standing there reading this list of names and I'm struggling on I will never forget that, Dollar. Never forget that. The children were so amused, but it was good-hearted, good-natured amusement. They were encouraging me, yes, and they got it right. And if I said it wrong, they'd shout it out, the right names. Oh, and I had to take my class to one of the wooden huts along there and get to know them. And that was my introduction. It was baptism by fire, I think.
And how old were they?
4 of the children in the class who were older than me. I couldn't believe it when they told me their birthday. I said, are you sure? Some of them were 23, 24 years old. Some of the African students, the Ugandan students. And yes, oh yes, no problem at all. So it was quite amazing.
And the youngest?
I think the youngest in my class would probably be about 14, 15. The thing I remember most about the children, they were so motivated to learn. I know I hadn't had much experience in UK, but the experience I'd had led me to believe educating them was going to be a battle. It was me against them. They didn't want to learn, and I wanted them to learn. But when I got to Kololo, oh, the children were waiting. They were enthusiastic. They wanted to learn. So it made teaching a pleasure. It was never a chore. It was always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's interesting. And why do you think that was? Where do you think that came from?
Well, I think the Ugandan students realized how fortunate they were to have the chance of an education, because it was not free. They had to pay for it. And although it seemed a relatively nominal sum to me, it must have been quite a substantial amount for their families to pay for them to come to school like that. And I think they felt a responsibility. They were being trusted to get an education and to help their families in the future. So I think there was quite a responsibility there.
Not all the kids were from those backgrounds, no?
No, they're not. A lot of the Asian children, I think they were motivated more by their parents and their peers than anything else. There's quite a competitive spirit about the education there. They wanted to do well. They wanted to do better than anyone else. I learned later on that there were other schools in Kampala, like Aga Khan School, an old Kampala school, and there was a competitiveness between the schools as to who would get the best exam results, who would win at sports. There was quite a competitive edge. It was good. It was motivating.
The demographics of like, of the classroom, what would you say was the sort of the split between the Asians and the African kids?
Well, for the school certificates levels, I would say maybe 50-50. But when we went to the higher school certificate, the A-level classes, it was predominantly Asian, some European children from the embassies.
So was there much interaction and mixing between the different students?
Very little, from my point of view, in class. Where we worked in groups, then I would make a positive effort to not just allow the same groups always be together. I like to mix them together. So a lot of the work would be group work, working maybe 3 or 4 in a group. And I'd make sure that the groups were mixed for those. But if left to their own devices, they wouldn't do that.
I think the most common experience is that, yes, there was that diversity in the classroom, but limited mixing at break times and stuff like that, and no mixing outside of school. No. So the lives were very kind of stratified. And yeah, part of that was because they were not your neighbors. Yeah, and that was, the town planning that was done by the British.
They didn't live in the same area, did they? They were quite distinct areas where the pupils lived, yes, quite definitely. And that makes a difference what happens outside the school environment.
Okay, and then a couple of years later, everything changes.
It did. I mean, it wasn't all peace and quiet up till then. I remember in December '69 that there was an assassination attempt at the then president, Milton Obote. And at that time in December, we took a trip to Queen Elizabeth National Park. And on the way there were numerous roadblocks. And one of the roadblocks, we were stopped. I had to empty the entire car onto the road. And I was beaten up by one of the, I wouldn't call them policemen. They were sort of militia that were checking, and they didn't like Europeans. I had a rough time. I had quite a few bruises, black eye. I spent my Christmas at Queen Elizabeth with sort of patches on my face where I'd been beaten. And that was just through driving. They didn't like us. They stopped us. They were drunk. You could smell the waragi on there. It was that sort of situation where you tried to keep a low profile, but it was underneath the surface. There was violence around. When Idi Amin took over, it was not totally a surprise, shall we say. There was definitely discontent in the country. So in January 1971, the coup, it was welcomed by people at the time. They were shouting, celebrating in the street, Idi Amin, Dada, and our savior, and they didn't know what was coming. But at the time, people celebrated that the army had taken over. It didn't take long for him to change that. And then things started to go downhill from then. Looking backwards, I think we should have stopped at the first contract, because the second 2 years was not the paradise that the first 2 years were. It changed. Dollar, it changed. It was not the same. And of course, when our men made his declaration about the economic situation and he would change it and correct it, you could see the writing on the wall. He was not a rational person, and there was trouble ahead. I don't think we'd expected him to target the Asian community so broadly as that. But it came as a shock to all of us. I mean, at Kololo, we were well over 50% of the school population was Asian, well over. So it was a major blow. It was the only thing that was talked about. It was a shock to all of us. I mean, we had our friends, our colleagues there. We could see how distressed they were. There was very little that we could do to help. I mean, we're in a position, we're visitors in a country, and we've got to be careful what we do and what we say. But we could see the stress, the worry. The pupils lost concentration. You can't concentrate on your schooling when you've got this hanging over you. Things came to a head. They started making people apply for exit visas. They had to go down and prove their nationality, show how much money they'd got. And they had to line up at the emigration department on Kampala Road.
I understand you had another incident with the army.
One of my roles in the Kololo was I ran a camera club after school, where I taught the children how to use the camera, how to develop film, how to print. I was a keen photographer. I took thousands of photographs while I was there. So I went down to Kampala Road and my wife, I said, we'll take some pictures of my students while they're lined up to get their exit visas. And there was a long line. Stood in the crowd watching this, taking photographs with my zoom lens to try and find my students in the crowd. And suddenly a hand on my shoulder, and it was an army person, and they arrested me and took me into the immigration building. They left my wife outside, distraught. I'd just been arrested, frog marched into the building with my camera gear. They took me to a small room and started to question me. I told them I was just taking photographs of my students. No, they couldn't believe that. And I was charged with being a neo-colonialist spy and Zionist infiltrator. I remember the phraseology very well because I asked him to write it down for me so that I didn't forget it. So that was the charge sheet: neo-colonialist spy and Zionist infiltrator. I had to look them up when I got back to find out what they all meant. I mean, I can laugh about it now, but the stories we'd heard about being arrested by the army and disappearing, it was not a funny time to be taken by the army, Idi Amin's army. So I started negotiating. I said how innocent I was, and he was looking at my camera gear. So I took the hint and I said, look, show you I'm innocent, take my camera gear. There's nothing on there, nothing secret on there. You have it, you can check it later. So he took the camera gear and let me go. He said, don't want to see you again. Pushed me out of the door. I lost my camera gear, but I saved my life, I think, with that. That was the narrow escape that I had with Idi Amin. Not a good time, but I kept a low profile after that. Some of the students would warn us that they were leaving soon and they would tell us. For others, I don't think they always knew. They just disappeared. I think their parents just took them and they made sudden decisions. And so we lived through a time of constant change there. The class numbers were never the same, the class composition. Even the staff disappeared, of course. I mean, it's not just the students who left. The staff were leaving as well. And so the classes were amalgamated to bring them so that they had a teacher. It was pretty chaotic. And once the exodus had sort of run its course, when we reached the time when there were very few Asians left in the school, in the community, Then we started to see the class numbers build up again, and the Ugandan students would come in. So we got more Ugandan students coming in, but of course they'd not had the background to prepare them for this education. The teaching changed completely. It was not the same academic aiming for this particular examination or this examination. It was more to try and get them to a level to prepare them to start an examination course more than anything. You had to be very flexible at that time, and the staff changed. The promotions within the school were amazing. The ones you least expected to ever make a good teacher, suddenly became heads of department, deputy heads, heads even, you know. How did that happen? So you went to school each day and you never knew what you were going to meet there. You never knew. It could be anything. It was a case of survive, count the days until it was time to leave. We were looking at the calendar. How long have we got? Can we survive this? Because you couldn't go out easily in the evening. It wasn't safe at night. You weren't exactly a prisoner in your home, but you had to be very careful. You couldn't travel the country like you used to go and visit exciting places. It was limited travel. Life closed in. It was still different, but it wasn't the fun. It wasn't the pleasure that it was before. We didn't really have the best chance to say goodbye to our friends and colleagues. They just sort of disappeared. They are there talking to you one day, you're going to school next day, oh, they've gone. I didn't say goodbye. You know, it's a poor closure. It wasn't a good closure.
Graham, I believe you've maintained various contacts with people from Kololo over the years. So, 50 years on, what is your assessment?
You think it's traumatic, which it is traumatic at the time, but in many cases, it was the start of a new life that gave them a real positive boost in life too. They've made a real success. And it makes you wonder whether if they'd stayed in Uganda, whether they'd have had the same success. At least it gave them the wide world. It took their opportunity, and I'm proud of them all. The positive attitude of the student. I taught for over 30 years afterwards, after I left Kololo, and I can't honestly say any of my classes have ever had that positive attitude to education. They really wanted, they came in, and if I was 1 minute late to the class, they were impatient, you know, why are you late? Whereas in UK, if you are late to a class, it's celebration by the students. It was a privilege to be a teacher. You were respected. And if you told people you were a teacher, that was a plus. But nowadays, it's changed completely. It's not the same respect. It's different. It's not the same positive vibe that you get from being a teacher.
Yeah, it's about, the status teachers had in society.
Yeah.
Was just completely at a different level.
It's difficult to explain when someone's not experienced that respect that the teacher gets from the pupils and the parents as well. Whereas I know in my latter years of teaching in UK, there was not that respect from parents when they come to see the teacher, not at all, not at all.
I understand you returned to the continent a couple more times.
I've been back twice. I took my wife and two daughters back to Uganda, 1999, I think it was. We talked so much about Uganda that our daughters really wanted to see it for themselves. And when they were of an age where they would appreciate it, I think they were late teenagers, we took a trip of a lifetime back, and we had just over 2 weeks in Uganda, stopping in Kampala, visiting the schools, visiting the places we'd talked about, visiting places I'd photographed. They'd grown up looking at my photographs of Uganda, and now they could see it for themselves. They could experience it. We went to the game parks. We had quite an experience. And I went back to Kololo, was made very welcome there by the headmaster and the staff. It was sad to see my laboratories very dilapidated. They'd not been maintained to the level that they should have been. They didn't have the finances, they didn't have the money to do it. But it felt sad that I'd worked hard to sort of get a good environment in the laboratories, and then to see it crumbling and falling apart. So I was happy to go back to the school, tinged with sadness at where it was. And then I retired in 2003 from teaching. And in 2005, my wife and I joined VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. We went to Malawi in order to train teachers. I wanted to give something back to Africa that it had given to me in I started my career in Africa, and in a way I finished it in Malawi too. Like bookends, start and finish. It was good.
And Malawi must have been quite different from Uganda, or not?
Oh, such poverty. You cannot imagine the poverty. And it was also at the time of the AIDS crisis. The training college in Lilongwe, the teacher training college where I worked there, it's funny to compare it. There were sudden losses of staff there too. Suddenly, colleagues were no longer there. Oh, they've been diagnosed with AIDS. They've gone back to die to their family group. And so you were losing staff because of the AIDS epidemic rather than being excluded by the government. So in a way, it was sad in that sense. So it was a difficult time. Here comes the sun. I think of Uganda, I think of the sunshine. Tell the story. Leave it for the next generation to listen to. Maybe they'll be amused. Who knows? But the story's there.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.